Thank you for joining us. I'm Gi-Wook Shin, Director of the Shorenstein Asia-Pacific Research Center. I'm really delighted to welcome you all to the Oksenberg Lecture, an event we hold annually to honor the legacy of our former colleague, the late Mike Oksenberg. Professor Oksenberg, or Mike is known to many of us, worked in many areas, from academia to policy and politics. So among many achievements he made, he joined Jimmy Carter administration and served as senior staff on NSF, and then negotiation between Washington and Beijing for full normalization in early 1979. So we really appreciate and miss his enthusiasm for strengthening American ties with Asia-Pacific nation and engagement with China. So I'd like to recognize a special guest today with us, David Oksenberg, Mike's son. So Mike's legacy is rich and enduring, and his mission of making China and United States understandable to each other has never been more crucial than now, when the two powers face multiple areas of confrontation and competition. So it is our special honor to welcome today's speakers, the Biden administration's top officials on Asia and China policy at NSC, called Campbell and Laura Rosenberger. So to introduce today's program, let me now turn to our China program director, Ji. She is a professor of political science here at Stanford and senior fellow at FSI, and then founding director of Stanford Center at Beijing University. So thank you once again for joining us, and please enjoy this afternoon. Jean.
Thank you, Gi-Wook. I was fortunate enough to have Michael Oksenberg as my doctoral dissertation advisor at the University of Michigan. And I know that he always thought that US-China relations was the most important bilateral relationship in the world. But geopolitical as well as economic conditions have changed US-China relations that Mike helped shape. No change is greater than that which has taken place in China and has fueled record-breaking growth over the last 4 decades. Since reform and opening in 1978, its accession into the WTO in 2001, and its increasing engagement with multilateral institutions and growing economic might, China's place in the world and its role, both constructive and disruptive, has grown in salience and impact. In the last 4 or 5 years, we have seen increasing volatility in that relationship, fraught with tensions, political and economic. Under the last administration, US strategic engagement with China that Mike worked so hard to implement, I think has moved to a period of US strategic competition. While that strategic competition will likely continue, what that competition will look like, and more broadly, the future of US-China relations today remain unclear. Thus, we are absolutely delighted and have the tremendous honor and unique privilege of having with us today 2 of the most consequential shapers of this critical relationship, who will help us understand the Biden administration's Asia policy and evolving strategy toward China and the current state of US-China relations. Still under the shadow of COVID, some countries more than others, how this relationship evolves between the US and China takes on an even more urgency and importance. The format for today's program will be as follows. First, we will hear remarks from Laura Rosenberger, the Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for China and Taiwan of the National Security Council. And then from Kurt Campbell, Deputy Assistant to the President and Coordinator for Indo-Pacific Affairs of the United States National Security Council. For the remainder of the hour, our distinguished panel has kindly agreed to an informal conversation with Michael McFaul, my colleague in political science and director of FSI. I will now turn over the proceedings to Mike, who will have the honor of formally introducing our speakers. Mike.
Thanks, Gene. Thanks, Gi-Wook. Laura and Kurt, thank you for joining us today. You can see this is a big event because we need 3 people to introduce you. That shows how important it is to us. But it also shows you how important it is that Mike Oksenberg was to our community. He was a fantastic colleague and friend of mine. And it is really a great, an amazing event that we have. Laura, you have his old job, just so you understand. And I think that's a fantastic moment. Let me briefly just introduce Laura and Kurt and turn it over to them. Laura, as Gene already said, Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for China and Taiwan at the NSC, where they're sitting right now, that beautiful room they're in. Laura recently was the Director of the Alliance for Securing Democracy and Senior Fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Before joining GMF, she was a Foreign Policy Advisor for Hillary for America, where she coordinated development of the campaign's national security strategies. Prior to that, she had tons of jobs in the US government. Let me just say, all the important jobs you need to work on the portfolio she has now. So I'm going to skip the long list here, Laura, but just say she's worked for all the important people who are now part of developing our policy towards China today. And a special shout out to my students. Laura was first worked at the State Department as a Presidential Management Fellow. And I want you all to Google that right now. It is a fantastic program and a great way to get into the government and later end up as Laura has today. After Laura speaks, we'll hear from Kurt. Dr. Kurt Campbell serves as Deputy Assistant to the President and Coordinator for Indo-Pacific Affairs at the United States National Security Council. Mike Oksenberg didn't have that job because that job didn't exist. That was created specially for this moment we're in, and I think we'll hear more about that later. Kurt previously was Chairman and CEO of the Asia Group, a strategic advisory and capital management group. In the first Obama term with me from 2009 to 2013, he served as the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, where he's widely credited as being the key architect of the pivot to Asia. And I want to emphasize that because there's a lot of talk around my town where I live now. We have a bunch of former Trump folks out here, Laura and Kurt, that say the pivot to Asia started just a few years ago. I want to remind you there was a pivot before, and Kurt wrote a whole book about it. And you should buy this book. Kurt, I think most of the money things that you used to do before you can't get, but I think you still can get your checks for your books, if I'm not mistaken, as a government official. Anyway, again, Kurt has written many, many other books as well. The architect today of the Biden policy towards China. So we could not be more thrilled than to have Laura and Kurt with us today. Over to you, Laura.
Thanks so much to Mike and to Gene and to Gi-Wook and to all of your colleagues. And thanks so much for inviting us to join you today. It's really a privilege. What I wanted to do was give a framework for how we are thinking about our approach to China here in the Biden administration. You know, I think Gene laid out the shift we have seen in China's behavior, particularly over the past decade, and the real strategic competition that we are in now. President Biden has underscored that we are in stiff competition, in his words, with China, and he has said that he welcomes that competition. But we believe both the United States and China do not want conflict. And so one of the key lines of effort for us, which I'll talk about in a moment, is essentially ensuring that we are maintaining that competitive stance with China, that we are outcompeting China, as the president has said he wants to do, but to do so in the way that does not actually lead to conflict. Our China policy basically has 3 main pillars. The first of them is investing at home, strengthening ourselves. Essentially, in any competition, one of the most important things you can do is make sure that you have the strongest possible hand. And we believe there's a lot of work when we came into office that probably had been neglected at home, that we really needed to invest seriously in ourselves, both in light of the pandemic and the crisis, the health crisis from COVID, the economic crisis that resulted from COVID, but also at dealing with some of the longer term challenges that have been neglected in our country, whether it's economic disparities whether it's cracks in our democracy, that we needed to ensure that we were putting ourselves on that strongest possible footing. I would note that one of the key dimensions of our competition with China is also in the technological space. And so one of the things that we've been spending a good bit of time on and working with Capitol Hill on is how do we actually invest in our own innovative base in a more significant way, ensuring that we have in the technology space what we need to be able to do to out-innovate and out-compete in a way that actually brings our strongest hand to the table. So investing at home and really strengthening our sources of strength domestically is a big piece of our approach. A second piece really speaks to another element of our sources of strength, and that is the United States network of global alliances and partnerships. We also believe this is an area that was neglected for the past few years, and we believe that the United States can do a significant amount when we are working in concert with our allies and partners around the world. I want to emphasize a couple of points on this that I think sometimes get misunderstood when we talk about working with allies and partners on China. This is by and large not about building an anti-China coalition. It is not about building an anti-China coalition. What we are seeking to do is, in President Biden's words, show that democracies deliver. Show that when democracies can work together to solve the world's greatest problems, that we actually can do an incredible amount of good, that we deliver for our own people, and that we can deliver for the world's people. That also involves making sure that not only do we have an affirmative offer, whether it's in international institutions, whether it's on the global health front, whether that's on vaccines, whether that's across the board in the economic space, making sure that we are actually working with one another to solve the world's problems. That provides a competitive counteroffer to what China is offering, to the more coercive ways that China tends to engage in its own engagement, and to make sure that we are actually bringing that net good. Now, obviously, there are places where we are working with our allies and partners to push back on some of China's worst abuses. And we've seen some early work that the United States has done, in particular with European partners and allies, as well as the UK and Canada, on imposing some sanctions on Chinese officials and entities that are engaged in human rights abuses in Xinjiang. We believe that there's a significant amount of work that we can do both to uphold universal values as well as impose consequences for when those values are being undercut. And doing that, working with our allies and partners, is an incredibly big piece of what we're doing. I've spent a lot of the last few months engaging with allied ambassadors, our partners, to make sure that we understand their perspectives on China and that they understand our perspectives on China. And one of the last pieces I'll emphasize on this point is that when we're thinking about ways that we can work together with our allies and partners to ensure that we have the strongest possible offering, we've tended in the past to always think in sort of geographic blocks when it comes to our alliance frameworks and our partnerships. And we think that when we actually look across, whether it's global supply chains, whether it's in technological innovation, whether it's on where we have different sort of economic complements to one another, sometimes the most interesting and natural configurations involve allies and partners in different parts of the world. And so we're looking at a range of ways that we can bring our allies and partners together around different issues, around different challenges, so that we can actually leverage our strengths best and address our vulnerabilities together. We've also, of course, rejoined in the Biden administration a number of international institutions where we believe it's incredibly important for the United States to show up, to show our global leadership, and to be ensuring that we are the ones that are continuing to set the rules and to maintain the order that has underpinned international peace, stability, and security for so many years. We know that Beijing is working itself, and then sometimes in concert with another place, Moscow, that Mike knows very well, to reshape rules in a way that we think are less in the interest of democracies and more in the favor of autocracies. And so that is something that, from President Biden's perspective, is a really important piece for us to continue to make sure democracies are shaping the rules of the future. The last piece that I'll emphasize here before turning it over to Kurt is the aspect of our policy that is countering China where we need to, and cooperating with China where it's in our interest to do so. Basically, we think that there are a range of ways in which we need to shape the relationship with China to ensure that we can do many things at once. It requires us to be able to counter China where it's acting against our interests and our values and those of our allies and partners, at the same time that we are engaging with China when we, on an ongoing basis with open lines of communication, candidly, honestly, in a way that's results oriented and aimed at obtaining practical results. At the same time that we're cooperating when it's in our interest to do so on issues like climate as well as others. Reshaping a relationship where we don't have linkages between issues, where we can do many things at once. We think this is how we can manage competition in a way that will prevent us from moving into conflict, but that will allow us to maximize cooperation where it is in our interest to do so. And we've seen that play out already in some of the early high-level engagements we've had with Beijing. President Biden's phone call with Xi Jinping in February, the meetings that Secretary Blinken and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan had in Anchorage, which Kurt and I both joined for, where we really were laying out the framework for the relationship as we see it going forward. That is, that ensures that we have lines of communication open with our Chinese counterparts, where we can again be honest and open and candid, and try to tackle things in a way that is aimed at solving problems, not simply dialogue for dialogue's sake. So at the end of the day, for President Biden, I think this is about making sure that we can outcompete, as I said at the top, do so in a way that shows that democracies deliver, and really puts values at the center of our foreign policy. So with that, let me turn it over to Kurt to talk about how he sees the China context and the broader Indo-Pacific as well.
Thank you, Laura. That was terrific. And it's so good to be with all of you out in California. I'm a native Californian, and it's always a pleasure to join, even if it's only on a video. I can think about what it was like back when I was young, and great to have old colleagues and friends on the line today. I want to particularly commend Mike McFaul and Jean for their service. We love the work that you do at the center, and I'm particularly grateful to be asked to speak basically about a legend. Mike Oksenberg is so well known in the community. I didn't know him as well as you all did, but when I was at the Defense Department in the 1990s, I had a chance to interact with him regularly. And what I can say about him, not only was he a great scholar, and this is pretty much the highest compliment, Mike, you will know in Washington, he was an intrepid bureaucrat. And he was always giving me suggestions about how to do battle with the NSC. I appreciated that at the time. Now I've tried to use those skills here in a different role here in the White House. As Mike said, this is a new job, and it's been a privilege and a pleasure to work with Laura and other colleagues. I think the idea is based on a realization that the lion's share of the history of the 21st century is going to be written in Asia. And as important as Asia has been to us historically, it has never been the #1 theater of at least regional focus. If you look back at our long history, it has always been a secondary theater, even during the Second World War, even during Vietnam, where the main theater was considered in Europe. So for the first time, really, we are now shifting our strategic focus, our economic interests, our military might more to the Indo-Pacific. This is going to be a long challenge. It will not be easy. It will not be overnight, but it will take a substantial effort of all of us in government, in the business community, and Mike, like the students that you're training up and engaging in Stanford. So I see my job as having several components. First is basically understanding the strategic environment in the Indo-Pacific. And it is buffeted by many different and overlapping and interlocking challenges. We all acknowledge the existential issues that confront us, climate change, issues around the pandemic, and nuclear proliferation. These are things that demand degrees of cooperation along the lines that Laura has indicated. It is also the case, since we've come to office, each of us have engaged in very deep strategic discussions across the Indo-Pacific and Europe and Latin America about how they see the region as a whole. And I think one of the things that has changed rather substantially in the last several years is a recognition or even a realization that policies are changing with respect to how China is engaging the world. We talked a lot in the 90s and 2000s about the rise of China's soft power. China clearly has so much to recommend it in every possible dimension. But what we've seen, I think, in recent years are examples, frankly, of what we might call China's harsh power or hard power in many respects. And what we are seeing right now across the board are a number of things that have been upsetting and in some instances destabilizing strategically. Earlier this year, we had some of the worst engagements on the Indian border since the 1960s, a kind of undeclared economic campaign against Australia, wolf warrior diplomacy, quite harsh actually, against friends in Europe, stepped up military interactions in the South China Sea, regular military actions, sorties across the Taiwan Strait, more pressure on Japan. Really across the board signals that China is determined to play a more assertive role. I think the challenge here is that if you look at the last 40 years, one of the things the United States has most, I think, favorably done is help build the operating system of the Indo-Pacific. And what that means is a complex interplay of a number of things. Our forward deployed engagements to preserve peace and stability, support for freedom of navigation, peaceful resolution of disputes, and open, engaged economic support in the region more generally. This was woven together in ways that, frankly, over the last 40 years led to the greatest period of prosperity and lifting people out of poverty in human history. And over the last several years, this operating system that I think we would argue has favored the United States so substantially has come under pressure from two sources. One, perhaps predictable, and the other a bit unlikely. I think we all know, Laura and I today were hosting Graham Allison, who was visiting down from Cambridge on one of his first flights, and we had a chance to sit and talk to him about how he sees the situation in the Indo-Pacific and China. And I think we all understand that China, as a rising power, takes issue with certain elements of the existing system, the dominant system, and would like to revise elements of that. That's a natural instinct, and it's incumbent on the existing states and the status quo to push back and to do what's possible to sustain elements of the operating system that has been so good for all of us in the region as a whole. But I think the surprise of sort of coming at the operating system over the last couple of years has come from the United States. I think during the Trump administration, questions about our forward deployed alliances, our military engagements, our trade policy, really across the board. And so one of the biggest challenges of the Biden administration is to try to underscore and reassure allies and friends that our stabilizing role, our more traditional approach, we're going to try to continue, and to make clear that we believe to do so is in American best strategic interests. So we are, I think, proceeding under the view that the best China policy really is a good Asia policy. And so as Laura indicated, not only have we rejoined the key institutions that basically animate the politics and diplomacy of Asia, but we're also determined to play an active role in the existing summitry and other meetings, the so-called East Asia Summit, the ASEAN Regional Forum, in which real issues of regional security, future diplomacy are undertaken. In addition, we've also tried to innovate where we can. I think you'll know that the president's first virtual meeting was a leader-led Quad meeting, which had a substantial commitment to the four countries stepping up to deliver 1 billion vaccines to Southeast Asia over the course of the next year. The president has tried to send a clear signal of the importance of Asia by hosting Japanese Prime Minister Suga and Korean President Moon as the first in-person visitors to the White House. President Moon was in Washington last week for a successful summit during which the Korean government and Korean industry committed over a period of about 7 days here in the United States to essentially invest almost $40 billion in technology, in supply chain development, all as a signal of Korea wanting to invest in Build Back Better and building stronger ties with the United States as we go forward. I think we believe that the best way to engage a more assertive China is to work with allies, partners, and friends. We understand that no country wants to make some sort of fundamental choice. They want to have the best possible relationship with China, but they believe that the best way to do that is to have a stable, steady, and secure engagement with Washington, and that's what we're seeking to provide. In terms of context, I think we all acknowledge that the period that was broadly described as engagement has come to an end. That we are now embarking on a new set of strategic parameters. As Laura indicated, the dominant paradigm is going to be competition. Our goal is to make that a stable, peaceful competition that brings out the best in us. There were elements of the Cold War that spurred us forward to innovate, to do a better job, and that's what we want to do here as well. But I don't want to lead anyone astray. This is a new period. It's like making a trail with underbrush, and you're hacking away and making progress as best you can. But it's difficult, it's challenging, and it will likely be there will likely be periods ahead in which there will be moments of concern. I think that is to be predicted, and the key under President Biden is to basically deal with these issues with a steadiness and a degree of predictability as we go forward. I will say the animating concern here, if you, as Laura and I and our team went around Asia over the course of the first 100 or so days, behind the initial statements of, gee, it's great to be working with a more familiar set of interlocutors and a strategic rationale that they, I think, understood perhaps a bit better. There are and continue to be concerns about American staying power, and frankly, concerns in some quarters and fears in other quarters about American decline, about whether America's best days are behind us. And one of our jobs, as Laura indicates, and frankly, first and foremost, our most significant contribution that we think the Biden administration can make is to be effective domestically, is to show that we can be effective in terms of dealing with the pandemic after a terrible first half, right? And basically provide vaccines, not just for the United States, but for the world. Second, to recover and to build back better, as we've heard, and deal with some of the neglected arenas that have a desperate need of support with respect to infrastructure and technology. And third, as important as anything else, to do it in a bipartisan way. I think we recognize that Asia policy is one of the few areas where we are seeing elements of bipartisanship. Laura and I spend a lot of time with Democratic and Republican senators to try to find that common ground to ensure that we're building on a strong base. So that's the most important contribution that we can make, and that will be the only way we can dispel concerns about American decline. There is almost a cottage industry, friends, in China predicting American decline. Most of the advisors to President Xi, deeply ideological, sort of profit the idea that the United States is late stage capitalism in decline and that China's time has come. I think beneath that, however, is a slight worry that this is not new. We've heard some of these predictions before. We heard it during the Korean War when American positions were overrun. in 1950. We heard it during the Vietnam War when we left unceremoniously in 1975. We heard it at the end of the Cold War when it was thought that the United States and the former Soviet Union were exhausted and Japan was the true victor. We heard it during the global economic crisis and during the Asian financial crisis, each time a sense that the United States had been dramatically wounded. And now more recently, with domestic upheaval, concerns about the coronavirus, worries about our purpose on the international stage, there are again worries about American decline. But one of the interesting things about the United States is our ability to rise up again, almost like a phoenix from the ashes, using our ingenuity, our determination, our technology, our investments to basically recreate elements of American power. And I think this is a moment where that alchemy is going to be required again, that for the United States to continue to play a leading role on the international stage. More than anything else, we've got to suggest not only to ourselves, but to the entire Indo-Pacific and the countries in Europe that want to work with us in Asia, that we're determined to play that leading role, and clear recognition that after a period of almost 20 years of strategic preoccupation in the Middle East and South Asia, the time has come for the United States to dig deeply into a strategic focus on the Indo-Pacific, to invest appropriately on capacity, on knowledge across languages, everything that, Mike, you're deeply engaged in at Stanford. So we want to conclude with this, but we also want to suggest not only is the Presidential Management Fellow a great program, but to keep your eyes open for opportunities at the White House and other parts of government. This is when Graham was with us at Mike this morning for lunch, you could see he was looking around at our staff, and they're young and they're the best in class, the smartest young people you could possibly imagine. And you could tell he was a little bit envious. He said, you know, what you are doing right now, you're president at the creation. And I feel like that too. My job now is to work with young people to ensure that they get to play this role in ensuring that the United States continues to play a leading strategic role in the most vital place on the planet. Mike, I'll turn it back over to you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Kurt and Laura. That was fantastic. Really covered a lot of territory in a small amount of time. There are several big questions to both of you, Laura in particular, you, about the nature of the China challenge. You mentioned you saw Graham today. I just taught about Graham's book yesterday in my class about great power competition. And you know, he focuses on power, and obviously power is a part of what you're talking about. But tell us to what extent it's also about different regime types, autocracies versus democracies, and to the extent that you're able, the role that Xi Jinping himself plays in terms of the new nature of this competition. In other words, was this just inevitable, or were there certain other factors that go into your analysis of the China challenge?
So let me both give you a sense of how I think the president thinks about this, and then a bit about where we see Beijing sitting on this. I mean, the president has been quite clear that he believes that the United States and other democracies are in a competition with autocracies. And he believes it's really important in everything that we do that we show that democracies deliver and really remains the best form of government. Now, again, that requires, as Kurt and I both mentioned, addressing some of the ways in which democracy has been falling short, or what I would actually say is, frankly, our tending of the garden of democracy has been delinquent. Democracy is a self, it is a continued process. It's not a moment in time. We actually saw this beautifully put in Amanda Gorman's poem at the inauguration. And I think that a reminder for us that we have a lot of work to continue to do to fulfill our more perfect union here at home, and strengthen the foundations of our democracy is part of what we are doing. But I do think that particularly as Beijing has grown in power, has become a more robust actor externally and on the world stage, we are seeing the ways in which Beijing is seeking to reshape rules and systems in a way that favors its system of government, and in a way that challenges, as Kurt was saying, both in the region and globally, the fundamental order that has underpinned peace, prosperity, and stability, and really has allowed for the flourishing of human rights and the universal values that are underpinned in the UN Charter and Universal Declaration and other pieces of really foundational institutions of the present order, really challenging those foundations. And so it is on us, working with other democracies, to update and renew those rules, norms, standards, right, when it comes to technology, the way in which technology is influencing our values and our world around us, to make sure that they are shaped in a way that is going to allow for the continued empowerment of the people of democracies. What I will say about Beijing's perspective and Xi himself, I think that there's no question, and Kurt and I have both spent time with Xi Jinping. He's a real believer in the CCP. He's ideological himself and sees the role of the party as central. And of course, Xi, like other leaders of the PRC before him, for them, the survival of the CCP is paramount. And I do believe that Xi Jinping has, we've seen many ways in which he has strengthened the role of the party internally within China. He certainly made changes to the way in which China's leadership is organized. Really centering power more on himself and less on the collective leadership model that we've had in the past. His anti-corruption campaign has certainly helped with consolidating that power and eliminating folks who might be seen as more of a threat. And so I do think that this is more than just power, to kind of come back to the crux of your question. This is about a nation state that is acting in a way that is deeply influenced by its system of government, in a way that does really frame out for us a competition of systems. And so that's basically how I think, how I would characterize the nature of the challenge on the lines you asked.
Mike, can I just offer just a couple of quick things? So first on President Xi, so Laura spent a lot of time with him when President Obama hosted him at Sunnylands. I was his control officer, took him around the United States when he was vice president as a guest of Vice President Biden. I completely agree with Laura. He is not only deeply ideological, but actually quite unsentimental, even though he'd studied in the United States. Not terribly interested in economics, very interested in infrastructure, very focused on how things were built and whether mass transit was effective or not. And I think you could easily come to the United States and get the wrong idea. Let's put it that way. So. So I would say that generally he was quite different than at the time President Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, and you could see he depicted himself as virile, as tough, and not an aged leader. That he was up for the challenge and that he was going to move China forward. I would say that the leadership selection process, Mike, in China is an incredibly elaborate process to try to identify the person that has ambitions to basically be a singular leader. They try to basically select for people that accept and support collective leadership. Right. And basically at the time, in the year or two before, she was selected almost unanimously, we believe, with the support of the Shanghai delegation and other groups directly. We think that someone like Bo Xilai had been identified as a real risk. And I think they all breathed a sigh of relief. They found the risk. And then lo and behold, when President Xi came to power, he acted in ways that I think no one anticipated. He has almost completely and utterly disassembled 40 years of careful, intricate mechanism designed for collective leadership. And so I would say today, the irony is when Laura talked about Alaska, Laura and I were with Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken, the two closest advisors to President Biden by orders of magnitude, right? We met, able diplomats, Wang Yi and Yang Jiechi. They are nowhere near within 100 miles of the inner circle of President Xi. The closest people that he works with, we never interact with. Very isolated and carefully kept away from sort of interaction with outsiders. I would also say that we believe that much of the analysis that's presented to him is deeply ideological and kind of presented in this context of American domestic struggle. In terms of the metrics of the competition, just quickly, an interesting comparison, Mike, would be something that you and I experienced. The early periods of the Cold War was really about a metric around nuclear weapons, around throw rate and conventional weaponry. The purview of that almost was exclusively the military. And
Right.
So over a period of 15 or 20 years, a group of academics had to become familiar with those issues to play a role in arms control and the like. And that was the nomenclature of the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union. There sometimes is a tendency to believe that the competition between the United States and China is mostly about military, when it's not. That's important, but by no means critical. The real issues, Mike, are going to play out in technology. The technologies of the 21st century, and I will tell you that President Xi was probably early in understanding and analyzing the strategic significance of 5G, robotics, AI, quantum computing, and human sciences. Those are areas where we have substantial advantages, but we're losing our competitive edge and we're going to have to run faster. So when we talk about what's the most effective things that we're going to have to do, not only invest appropriately, but your students need to be able not only to talk knowledgeably about the complexities of Asia, but also talk more than a paragraph about what 5G technology software is.
Well, you're speaking to the right crowd here, because people here
I know.
study 5G and AI, but it's a great point. Both really great points. I know we're going to run out of time, so what I'm going to do is bundle lots of questions in a creative ABCDEFG way about prescriptions. And Kurt, I'll turn to you first, and Laura will get the last word, and you can just answer whatever you want. But there's lots of questions about prescriptions here, and how to obviously the nature of the challenge, how to address it. People are asking, tell us about changes versus continuities with the Trump administration. I jokingly invoked your book, Kurt, but there are some continuities, there are some changes. Maybe help us understand those. Related to that, lots of people are asking specific questions about, Kurt, what you referred to in your book is the Asia's operating system. How does it look today compared to the last time you were in the government? And maybe three big buckets. I think I know the answer to a couple of them, but maybe not. One is on the bilateral trade side. The Trump administration used tariffs. People want to know what you're planning to do with that. Two, related to that, TPP. Is TPP completely dead, or are you trying to bring that back? Three, as you already invoked, the Quad. Is there a bigger, larger agenda that might be there? And then fourth, change in continuity with how we, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but we just read, Kurt, we just read like 5 of your articles yesterday in my class, just so you know, so it's on my mind, about the success of avoiding war over Taiwan. That is a continuity that Democrats and Republicans have shared for many decades. How do you tackle that question in terms of the Asia's overall operating system? And Kurt, we'll go to you first, and then Laura will get the last word.
Thanks, Mike. Those are good questions. Look, I think we readily acknowledge that there are elements of the Trump approach that should be built on. We think some of the analysis of the problem that we saw in the Trump administration was accurate. We don't think many elements of the policies that he followed, which were deeply bilateral, alienated a lot of allies, generally forsook any kind of engagement in international organizations. We don't think that was appropriate. But I think understanding that the character of Chinese power had changed from a period in which we were working under the view that engagement and that we will be able to see an evolution in how China conducts itself at home and abroad. And Mike, I do want to just say for a moment, anyone who's worked with China for 30 years, or any period of time, I've done it for 30 years, the changes that we see just in everyday interactions are dramatic. And any of you who have Chinese friends know what it's like trying to have a conversation now. There's a lot of, I can't talk about that. Right. It's a different time now. And you can sense that for many of our colleagues, the people that we worked with in academia, in think tanks, it's hard for them, it's challenging. But it's also unmistakable. So yes, there are some areas of continuity, but I think probably more areas of difference. I would say that the operating system is still intact, but under substantial strain. And it's going to need to be reinvigorated in a number of ways, not just by the United States, but other countries that use the operating system. And that means Japan, that means South Korea, Australia, countries in Europe that want to do more in Asia and across the board. And I think the arena that I worry the most of going forward is it's going to be important for the United States to have a positive economic vision of what it wants to contribute, what it wants to engage on in Asia. And I think you're right to say it's still early days. That's a goal we're working towards, but it is an essential feature. We can do everything right in Asia, but without an economic strategy, it's hard to be successful. That's what Asians are looking for as we go forward. I think we're ambitious about the Quad, Mike. We recognize that it must address the needs of the people. We're all maritime democracies. We focused our first meeting at the leader level on a vaccine initiative that brought creative American and Japanese financing and American technology and Indian industrial capacity and then ultimately Australian ability to deliver a vaccine initiative that will bring 1 billion new doses to the global stage. I think we want to look this fall to convene an in-person Quad, and the hope will be to make a similar kind of engagement on infrastructure more generally. And I do want to underscore, I don't think we're set on this is not a fancy club. If there are other countries that believe that they'd like to engage and work with us, the door will be open as we go forward. And then lastly, on Taiwan, I think, you know our mantra, I'm not going to repeat it. Taiwan Relations Act, One China, I think it's fairly clear. Our goal right now, though, Mike, is frankly to enhance deterrence. And we do that through a number of integrated efforts, clear statements of purpose, private warnings and assurances, encouragement on Taiwan to take the appropriate defense reform acts, making sure that our own capability is strong and vibrant, and to bring other countries in to the effort. And so you will have seen both Japan and South Korea publicly reaffirm Korea for the first time ever, Japan for the first time since the 1960s, the desire to maintain peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait.
I know we're at time, so I'll just maybe pick up on the question of change versus continuity that Kurt already touched on, and just elaborate a small bit on that. Kurt mentioned in his comments the importance of a bipartisan approach on the China challenge. And I just want to use that as the jumping off point, because I prefer to use that versus the continuity change frame, because I think it's so critically important that the United States be able to approach this challenge in a united way. One of the things that we see from Beijing across the board, whether it's between the US and our allies, whether it's between different elements of our government, whether it's between political parties, Beijing likes to try to divide us. Beijing believes that when we are divided against one another, that we have a weaker hand, and that's because we do. And the other thing that Beijing believes is that our own partisanship is part of what shows that democracy is not working, and we have to prove that wrong. And we have to do that by showing that we are united across party lines. Now, again, as Kurt suggested, that doesn't mean we're always going to agree 100% on the approach. And we always are going to have room for debate. And that's one of the great things about democracy, is that we have the space for debate, but we figure out a way forward together. And I think that that's an incredibly important piece of what we are trying to do. I'll just emphasize, though, two other pieces that I do think are an element of our policy that we feel had been missing previously. One is, basically what I talked about is the outcompeting investing in ourselves, the sources of strength in our allies and partners. Kurt talked about it as running faster. A lot of what we saw the last administration doing was some of the important work on defense. Mike knows I'm a football fan. We saw a lot of blocking and tackling happening on the defensive side of the ball, but not a lot of solid run game or even some West Coast offensive passes down the field. Exactly, and I think that really bringing that offensive game, that affirmative piece to the table is a big part of what we're trying to do. We're really mobilizing ourselves at home, mobilizing our allies and partners in international institutions, et cetera. The other piece that I think is just so important, and again, I'll come back because this is really central for the president, is the centrality of values in our approach. This is true on his foreign policy more broadly, but specifically with China. He spent 10 minutes in his phone call with Xi Jinping talking about values and why it's so important to him as a person, how it oriented his early career from the civil rights movement, bringing him into politics, why any American president really has to represent these values in their engagements abroad, because this is who the American people are. This is a deeply animating point for the president. It's a deeply animating point for me. Mike, you know me well. This is sort of at the core of much of my work. It's for Kurt as well. But I think that this is really an important piece too. And this is not about, somehow lecturing to China and trying to hold China down by talking about these values. This is rather upholding these values that are really, as the president told Xi Jinping, in our DNA. And so that's the other piece I would just really highlight as I think something that does distinguish from what we've seen for the past few years.
Laura and Kurt, I can't imagine a better way to honor Mike Oksenberg than what we've just done over this last hour. A real tour de force. You are there at the creation, Kurt, like you said. Graham's right. And it's reassuring to me as an American that the two of you are there working on it. Thank you so much. You've been incredibly generous with your time, and we will send you young people to join your team.
Thank you, Mike.
We will make sure we build that team up. So thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you all.
Thank you all. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.